Hi, HRN listeners. We're celebrating our 15th anniversary, and we have a really fun campaign and an ask for you. This 15th anniversary tour is aiming to bring you closer to unique food and music experiences in some of the most exciting cities in America. All the while, we're raising funds to support our work empowering the next generation of food systems storytellers through our fellowship programs. Here's how it works. Donate to HRN and be entered into a raffle in the city of your choice to win a dinner for two at a noteworthy restaurant and tickets for two to a concert at a prominent local venue. We have incredible partners in New York, Los Angeles, Philadelphia, Nashville, Las Vegas, Charleston, Asheville, and Ardmore, Pennsylvania, who have donated a meal for two and two tickets to a concert of the winner's choice. And all donations help fund our fellowship programs, where we're helping to build essential workforce readiness skills and food system storytelling skills. Check out heritageradionetwork.org/15 to donate and enter to win today. That's heritageradionetwork.org/15. Thank you.
You're listening to Item 13, an African food podcast, and I'm your host, Yom Tego. Every other week, we'll delve into the world of African food, including chefs, curators, and bloggers. Here's the show. So welcome to Item 13, Vonnie.
Thank you.
Yeah, I'm excited to talk to you. I know we had a podcast conversation, so there's going to be a few exciting things I think we're going to be talking about. We're going to be focusing on food media and the representation of our community, and then also from your perspective as a food writer, of course. And so I wanted to first start with who you are. Who is Vonnie? Tell us a little bit about yourself.
That's a great question. I'm a lot of things, but for the purpose of this podcast, I am a food writer, I'm a copywriter, I'm a food blogger, I'm a lover of food, I love to talk about food. Food is my life. I don't know whether that's a good but for this podcast, it's a good thing. I'm just someone who loves food and loves talking about the nuance of food, the politics of it, what really goes on behind our plate, right? So those are the things that I'm really interested in.
What about where you're from and how that ties into like the lens through which you look at food?
So I am Ghanaian-American. My parents are from Ghana. I mean, my whole family is from Ghana, essentially. I lived there when I was a kid for 3 years, and then I came back. That shaped a lot of who I am. I've always pretty much grown up in my culture, even before I went to Ghana. My parents are very staunch Ghanaians. Like, they're very proud. They're very proud to be from Ghana, and they're very proud of the culture. So I grew up with a lot of that pride. And so I feel like when I went to Ghana, this kind of cemented that pride and made me really realize this is where, my ancestors come from. This is who I am in essence. How that shaped me as a food writer, I think as a person, just in general, just when you live in a different country for a while, I think learning a culture and its perspective that's outside of the American Western perspective opens up your eyes to just different ways of living. You're a lot more open. You're a lot more forgiving. You see things a little bit differently.
Right.
So for that, I'm really grateful that my parents pretty much dropped me off in Ghana for a few years. We'll come get you.
And what are your earliest memories, I guess, of cooking or food? Do you remember when or how you learned how to cook?
Oh, that's a great question. So when I was younger, I remember I always wanted to eat American food because I always get Ghanaian food in the house. I always wanted McDonald's. I remember helping out my mom a little bit, but I actually grew up with my stepmother for some of my formative years. And so she's the person that actually taught me how to cook. So a lot of times I would just learn from her, try to be helpful in the kitchen by cutting onions. And then when she saw I could cut onions well, she'll let me do the stew. Or she saw I could do the stew well, she'll let me do the soup. So I actually learned from her. And then my mom lived in Ghana for most of the time, most of my life, actually. So when she came back from Ghana, I kind of learned more things from her too. So I really learned from the matriarchs in my family. My father, bless his soul, is not a great cook. But, he did his best. But I really learned a lot from my mom and my stepmother.
That's funny. Okay. We're gonna segue. I get one. I wish we had time to delve into that. The whole patriarchy
Maybe
situations,
maybe off the podcast we can talk about that.
but let's segue. So you're a food writer in food media. How does a person get into that? Like, I find that actually incredibly fascinating. Like, how do you not only decide to be a writer, but specifically a food writer?
So yeah, that's a great question. So I always had a love of food. When I was in high school, I actually wanted to go to culinary school, but my father, being the African person that he is, was like, no, you're going to do a career in STEM. And I was like, okay, sure, I'll be a doctor. But I've always loved food and been fascinated by it. But I think that, as an immigrant, you always hear the narrative that your parents work really hard, so they want you to have a great career. And a lot of times a great career is something that's in STEM, something that they consider stable. And I understand that in retrospect, but as a kid, I didn't really quite understand that. So I was pre-med in college and I switched to psychology. And then I worked in social work for a while. And then I went back to get my master's in public relations. So I ended up doing an internship at this small mom and pop food PR firm. And I loved it. Like, I would do extra work. I would always be there. I'm like, you going to this? I want to go. I found myself really, really interested, just talking to my bosses after work about food and wine and the industry. Right. And it just felt like home. It just felt like, okay, this is what I want to do. This is where I belong. Like, while I'm sure I'll make a great doctor, that's not really what I want to do, And, I understand my parents' sacrifice, but I think part of the sacrifice is giving your children the freedom to do what they want to do in a country that can make it possible, Right. So for me, I took food PR. I took that experience and I started with an old partner of mine, our first food blog called The Black Forks. So that was our way to talk about food in our language, in the way that we kind of talked about food. And it was something that we didn't really see too many people. There were a few people doing it as well, but we wanted to be part of that group. And so that's how I got my start with the Black Forks. I did that for a few years, took a little break, and then I started my own food blog, Sincerely Vonnie. And then how I got into food writing was Portia Wilson, as you know, is an amazing writer. Right. She invited me to be on her podcast. And I actually met a former editor, not former editor, from Food and Wine there. And she was super nice, and I kept in contact with her. And that's how I got my first start in Food and Wine, was through her. Oh, nice. She came up to me and was like, you did a really great job. I'd love to know more about you. And I'm talking to her for a half an hour. And I'm like, oh, what do you do, by the way? She's like, oh, I'm this editor for Food and Wine. I'm like, oh, wow. Okay. So that's how I got my start there. So it was really interesting. It wasn't as difficult as I thought it would be. I've been fortunate in that regard because I was looking to break into more mainstream food writing while still keeping the Sincerely Vonnie voice, but I didn't necessarily know how to do it. I think, writing for your own blog is a lot different than writing for a mainstream publication. It's a lot more the same thing, right? Like, you're writing your own voice, you're making sure that the copy is great, but there's also things that go on in the freelance world that has an independent food blogger or food person you might not necessarily know about. So that was just a really nice way to just transition from blogging to doing more of the mainstream writing. Right. So, yeah.
There's a lot to unpack in there. It's good. I'm trying to see where do I want to go first. So maybe let's talk about Sincerely Vonnie. So that's your blog. What kind of stories do you write about? Where do you get inspiration to come up with, topics or themes or people to profile if you do that?
Mm-hmm. So Sincerely Vonnie, I didn't want to just make my personal diary because that's for my own personal. I wanted to talk about food through my personal lens. Okay. So for me, just always looking for really interesting stories about the African diaspora, about my life. Like, I talked about rejecting patriarchy in the kitchen because, a lot of times, and I'm not going to say not all West African cultures, but a lot of West African cultures is very much the man is the head of the household. He doesn't do any of the quote unquote women's work like cooking and cleaning. And that's what we are left to do as women. And I want to talk about fighting that, because I personally did not like growing up like that. Yeah. And it's not something that I want to teach my future children. So it's just thinking about food and thinking about my life through a personal lens, and in a way that's authentic to my voice and authentic to me. For me, you may not agree with what I say, but I know that what I say is true to me and it's in my genuine voice, and that's all that matters.
No, that's interesting. And yeah, I encourage people. I really like the layout of your website and some of I really think people, obviously I'll put a link to that so people can check it out, because you're one of the few voices out there that's sharing from our perspective, which I think is really, really important.
I appreciate
so in terms of freelancing, could you give us a sense of what that looks like? One, just from a general curiosity for the audience, and then if there are specifically people that are interested in getting into that space, like what does it look like to be a freelancer? Are you constantly pitching? Like what I mean, obviously you were you had the good fortune to run into that food and wine editor, but outside of that, like what's it must not be that easy.
No, I'm making it sound easy. It's not. Her name is Jordana Rothman. I should shout her out, by the way. She's super nice, and she read my blog, and she put my blog out there on Twitter and was like, this is a great voice. And I appreciated her for that. So I know that not every freelancer gets that same opportunity. So I'm grateful for that. I'm sorry, your question was like how to get into freelancing and stuff, right?
Yeah, and just like how does that work? So if I decide to be to become like a freelancer, a food writer freelancer, how am I constantly pitching? Am I always looking for? How do I get in touch with publications to write my stories essentially and make sure that I'm eating?
No, that's true. I would say number one, I learned this the hard way, but I learned this pretty quickly. You kind of have to work up to where you're freelancing, you're able to afford your bills. So when I freelanced, I also did a whole bunch of things on the side. I had to make a little bit of that sacrifice because that meant that I didn't write as consistently as I did, but also meant that I did other things like social media and photography on the side to supplement my income. So I think the first thing you have to decide and tell yourself is that you're not going to go from 0 to 100 quickly, that you may have to pick up a couple of side hustles. It's okay to have a full-time job and freelance. I know that some people are like, oh, you're not a real freelancer if you don't have a full-time job. But honestly, people have responsibilities, right? Like I send money home to my family. There are a lot of people who are immigrants who do the same thing. So you may not have the same flexibility financially as somebody else who, parents pay for their car or so keep that in mind. I think a lot of times when you hear freelancers and you hear that, they're making this kind of money, you don't really realize what's going on in the background. For anybody that wants to start freelancing, I would say get on food media Twitter. It is the bane of my existence, but it's also extremely useful. I would first start by following editors. I'm giving advice that I don't really use as often, but it works, guys. Follow editors, like figure out who they are, what makes them tick. Follow on like food news. So like go on all the blogs, the websites, see what people are talking about. Don't be afraid to pitch. I think how I learned how to pitch was I asked people how to pitch. I'm like, hey, like I see that you're doing this. How did you do that? Don't be afraid to ask, because pitching is hard in the sense that you have to condense your whole story in 200-300 words max. You have to make it really interesting. You have to keep in mind that the editor is getting plenty of pitches every single day. They're overwhelmed, they're stressed. So how do you stand out in the inbox, right? And that's not a skill that comes to a lot of folks intuitively. So don't be afraid to ask like writers, even online if you don't know them, if they can give you some advice. I mean, keep in mind that some people may say no because that is an ask on their time, and time is precious, but it doesn't hurt to ask anyway. I personally love this group called Study Hall. The website is studyhall.xyz. And if you are, I know it's interesting website, but if you are a media worker of color, it's only $1 a month. And Study Hall to me has been one of the most invaluable resources because you have a whole bunch of freelancers talking about everything about how to get paid well, how to pitch. They even have a section called like Pitches That Work. And it's just a great community of freelancers that do a whole bunch of things, from like people who work in beauty to politics to sports to food. And I will probably recommend that as like the number one resource that I use. Twitter is number two. Number three, like, don't be afraid of rejection. Like, you will write, your pitches will get rejected. If the editor is nice enough, they may say like, hey, let's go with this angle instead.
Right.
You are going to be pitching constantly. I would say find your tribe, find your community of freelance writers from anywhere. It doesn't necessarily have to be the industry that you work in, but if it is, that's even better. And like, talk to them, because a lot of times writing is a very much an isolating thing. You do it, at home on your laptop. Right. And sometimes you need people to bounce ideas off of, or just to talk. I mean, for me, Cassandra Rosario, Food Before Love, is like one of my dearest friends. She's also a great resource. She's a writer as well. So you need that community of people, because sometimes things happen. You're like, what the? And you just need to talk to somebody and say like, am I going crazy here?
Yeah.
So, find your people, go on Twitter, and studyhall.xyz is a great resource for upcoming freelancers.
Cool. So I was reading one of the stories that you wrote on for Taste, called Fufu's Many Faces. Mm-hmm. And I thought one, it was interesting in that, like, a lot of, for better or for worse, as more Western media is looking to diversify their food content, a lot of the initial stories, a lot of the stories that are coming out on food about West Africa is about jollof, right? So there's all sorts of different takes on jollof, and so it was refreshing to see, this piece on fufu, and I was wondering how you were able to sell this, and like who, when you pitched it, or based on the conversation, who's your intended audience?
Ooh, great question. So the fufu story is something that I wanted to do maybe close to a year ago. Because like you said, a lot of times when we talk about jollof, Right. And I think it's one of those foods where, if you're not a West African, it's not too quote unquote intimidating for you. Like, it looks like orange rice. So you're like, oh, paella. Oh, yellow rice, and I think, exactly. I think sometimes as Africans, we tend to accommodate other people instead of standing strong in what we believe in our food. And so I didn't want to do jollof, because I'm just like, there's so much more to our food and our culture than jollof. Even in Ghana, Ghana's a relatively small country, but there's so many ethnic groups that cook so many different kinds of food. Then why are we just talking about jollof, So
yeah. I'm sorry, go ahead.
No, go ahead. You're good.
No, I was going to say that, so I'm of two minds. When this jollof conversation comes up, I'm always of two minds, right? So on the one hand, I think that jollof as the dish itself is overrated. I just think there's just a lot more interesting food, right? That you can have, whether it's from Ghana, from Senegal, Nigeria, whatever. But on the other hand, I think that it's like you pointed out, it's like a good entry point, or a good even conversation starter. And literally, so I'm in New York this weekend, and I was walking down the street in Midtown somewhere, and some random person stopped me to ask where I was from, and because based on what I was wearing. And I said I was from Ghana, and he was like, whoa, you guys are the ones that have the best jollof, right? And I was like, I didn't want to roll my eyes, but I feel like for people, that's a good, like, cultural identification thing. And so from that perspective, I don't think it's like so bad that if that's how, people are going to identify, or,
right.
So it's a double-edged sword, I think, in some ways.
No, it is, because like that guy's like, yes, we do have the best jollof rice. I'm glad you acknowledge basic facts. Nigerians don't come for me. But also, it's just like, there is so much. I mean, even me as a Ghanaian, I'm Fantine ever, and there's so much food that I haven't even eaten, because I've never been to Ho before. I've never been to Tamale. I don't have Ghana relatives, and there's even my friends who are gone, they'll give me food. I'm like, I never ate this. What is this? There's so much diversity, and it's like, really, is jollof rice the hill we want to die on?
Right. Definitely not.
Yeah,
Definitely
like jollof
not.
rice is great, but it's not like it's not that interesting compared
Yeah,
to
I don't
everything else
think
that
that's,
we
yeah,
have.
I agree. But anyway, on that note, on that jollof note, we'll take a break here, and then when we come back, we'll speak on representation in food media. And I have a lot to say, but I'll hold back and let you sort of drive that conversation. So we'll take a break and we'll be right back.
You're listening to Item 13, an African food podcast. We'll be right back.
So we're back. So I had said that we were going to talk about representation in food media, but Vonnie reminded me during the break that she actually didn't share the story of how that fufu story came about. So we're going to do that first, and then we'll talk about representation.
So yes, how the fufu story came about. So as I mentioned earlier, it was something that I wanted to write about for a while. I pitched it specifically to Taste because they do this really interesting kind of like takes on home cooking and cooking from different cultures.
Okay.
So I knew it would be a good fit there. Why fufu? Because I get tired of talking about jollof rice. And fufu sounds like something simple, right? Like a lot of people just, if you're not from West Africa, you describe it as a dough or a dumpling, which it is not. Fufu is intricate, it's involved, it's labor intensive. It's a beautiful thing, right? And it's something that I grew up with. And it's one of those things where I'm starting to appreciate my food a lot more just for the labor of it, because everything that people think is cool now, farm to table, picking up, the lettuce from the ground and putting it in a salad. That's what we do back at home.
I am telling you. So it's so incredible. So I'm going to, I do want to talk about it now, but I'm going to this food innovation event next week in the Netherlands.
Mm-hmm.
And one of the big things they're talking about is like food, farm to table, food sustainability, food as medicine. And I jumped on the planning team late for this, but we're trying to craft different panels or whatever. And some of the questions they were asking, I was like, you know what, guys, like some of this is just, it's normal. It's like, I can't believe we're actually having to have this as a discussion. And so I started talking to them about like examples of how, different things my mom would do, like how we grew up treating food.
Right.
And so I inadvertently talked myself into having an Africa panel, but that's like a whole other conversation. But, and then like, and maybe this is actually segues into representation, because if I wasn't there, the conversation was going to be purely on a Western focus on like, how do we do that? But there are solutions. I started talking about fonio, for example, that's naturally good. We don't need to make processed gluten. There's a lot of naturally occurring like cassava is gluten free. And so the fact that Africa is missing from this conversation is just like a whole. Anyway, like I told you, I have like I can get into my feelings about some of this stuff. So, but I'm not gonna take over the conversation here. But yeah, that just,
no, you bring a good point.
I was just like, anyway.
Yeah, because you bring a good point where like Africa is the second biggest continent in the world. We get exports from other countries. I mean, you hear about the stuff that they put in our palm oil and the plastic they put in our rice. It's like we make our own rice, we make our own palm oil. My grandmother used to have a palm oil tree, and literally one of my uncles would go cut the palm from the palm tree, and we will roast palm nuts and make our own palm oil. This is what everybody does in Ghana, right? Like it's not like this thing that it's not to be taken for granted, but it's not a big deal. It's like, yes, your food comes from the ground, you get it from the ground. Like, what else do you need to know? But it's very true. It's like when we talk about food, Africa is not part of the conversation. And I mean, I think there's 1,001 reasons for that. And like you said, we may not have enough time to get into that, but a lot of it has to do with colonialism, racism, people exporting us for our resources and then leaving us to shit. I'm sorry if I don't know if I can curse, but leaving us high and dry and, exploiting our people, our resources, our intelligence, because African people, we are intelligence, we get exploited.
Yeah.
And then when we talk about some of the political things that go on in our countries, it's not necessarily for the benefit of our citizens, So, that's a whole other, whole other podcast.
Yeah. So I mean, like, I guess that's the conversation we're having, though, and I wanted to get from your perspective at least what your experience has been like, as you're trying to, get your stories out there from like your lens as a first gen African. Just if you have any specific experiences, or just generally what your experience has been and how you try to navigate that.
That's a good question. I think honestly my experiences have been mostly good. Not perfect, but mostly good.
Yeah.
I think I'm writing at a time where Africa is interesting to people, because Africa is a quote unquote next big thing, where it's like, no, we've
been here.
Like if you believe in evolution, like we created a civilization. So no, we were actually here before you, but sure, we're the next big thing, I think that food media is really interesting, where people don't want trite stories. People don't want the same old. People don't want the same old cliches. People are looking for something different. And that's what Africa offers, something different, the great unknown, or, whatever people want to call it. And I think for me, it's interesting because I'm kind of on two minds of this. It's like one point, on one end, I want to say, okay, well, I want to write all these stories. And on the other end, it's like, I don't want to feel like I'm exploiting my own continent. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
Because I think the mistake people make is like, oh, well, you're from Ghana. You must know all about Ghana, all about West Africa. It's like, no, I don't. If you live in America, if you were born and raised in America and your family comes from America, can you say that you know all about America? No, because that's almost impossible. So I kind of don't want to fall into the trap of being a quote unquote African expert, because I am not. I just speak from my own experiences. Of course, I always do my research, like I did for the Fufu article. Actually, I had to do a lot of research into that. But I don't want to be known as an expert, because the only thing I'm an expert in is my own experiences and the way I look at my life, and that's it. And if I could speak to that eloquently, then I'm fine. But I don't want to be known as, the expert in African cuisine. As a great researcher of African cuisine, absolutely. But I think it's interesting now, because if people want that story, but it kind of makes me wonder, do you want it because you're genuinely curious, or do you want it because it's the next big thing? You're trying to hop on it.
Trend. It's a trend that's going on right now.
And you're trying to be a pioneer of that trend, so you can so
and then as you talk about that, I was actually just thinking about Top Chef last season, right? Yeah, it was just last season.
Yep.
Not been a long time, with Chef Eric Ajipong, who is in Ghanaian representing.
Yes, Black Stars.
Yes, which for me was one of the, I don't know if it actually was the best, but I think I just felt like,
in my opinion, he was the best.
No, I'm not saying if he was the best. I'm saying if the season was the best, in that I felt like I was so invested in Eric's story that I probably read everything. Like after every episode, I was reading all the takes and like was just into this episode. I think it was partly because, probably because Chef Eric was on there, and not that he was just on there as a token. Like I felt like he killed it all the time.
Yeah.
So we get to that season finale, and for those that don't know, that season finale with 3 finalists, and Eric, they left them, just for the benefit of those that are not familiar with the show. When the 3 finalists were chosen, they were given, they were told that they were going to do this multiple course dinner, and they had to come up with a theme or how they were going to present it. And Eric had shared that he was going to do this transatlantic slave. His progression, of course, was going to reflect the transatlantic slave trade. And I thought, oh my God, this is genius. I can't wait to see this. This is going to be amazing. But then the twist, I guess, which TV producers have to add whatever for ratings or whatever it was, they made them just make that first course, and then based on that, they cut an extra person. And like, I'm not going to waste. There's all sorts of stories, and you can watch it online somewhere, I'm sure. But the long story short was that Eric was eliminated. And I just, the way in which it happened, I just felt like, one, I was obviously strongly disappointed, but I also felt like there was just something off. It's going to be my PC way of saying there's just something off about how it all went down. And so in my usual fashion, like I went online trying to find different takes, and it just seemed like everybody was like moving along. Okay, that, you know, that was disappointing, but we're moving on. And then I found your piece that like spoke to the core of exactly how I was feeling. That like, no, this guy was robbed, and like I can't believe not a lot more people are talking about it. And I think that again, part of the conversation on representation and making sure that there are enough diverse voices, because the take from most of quote unquote mainstream was, you know, it's unfortunate, but let's move on. But I thought there were just a lot of other layers to this that people were not taking into account, that you covered in your piece, right? So you talked about representation, especially at that judge's table. There were not even just at that finale episode. There were a couple of times where I thought, and I don't know if you remember, there was a point where I think even Eric was frustrated, where he had to push back. It's like, if you don't know what the dish is supposed to taste and feel like, you can't say, oh, this is too great. I remember he made some egusi something, and they're like, oh, it's too gritty. And he's like, that's the way it's supposed to be. It's not, this is not French cuisine.
Yeah,
so
it's not a puree.
Right. So you can't judge something that, you know, I don't know. It's like, anyway. So I found that piece, and that again for me, one is example of like how important your work is.
Thank you.
And just anyway, but I wanted to get your thoughts on what you thought about, you know, that season, that particular episode, and then like that move to write the story.
I mean, you pretty much encapsulated all of my thoughts. I watched it honestly because of Eric.
Right.
I can't remember the last time I watched Top Chef that faithfully, but I mean, I loved Eric on the show because he was unapologetically Ghanaian, was unapologetically Bronx. Like, he's like, this is where I'm from, this is where my people is from. You're gonna love it, you're gonna leave it, but you will love it because I am a great chef. And he showed that time and time and again, episode through episode. And so you make a really good point when you say that, you know, when he got eliminated and everyone was like, okay, well, unfortunate, but, you know, let's move on.
Right.
And it's like, no. There has been so many things that has transpired prior to the elimination.
Right.
We have to talk about all of that, like the gritty texture of the egusi stew. You know, when he made the Congolese sauce with the fufu, and I think Tom Colicchio was like, "This is like a dumpling." I think he said, "Yeah," but I can understand why he said, "Yeah." He's like, I'm trying to cook here, so you know, I'm just gonna tell you whatever you want to hear. And like, we haven't really seen that level of representation in African food in so long, and I love the way he did it because a lot of times people think Africa, even to this day, even among people who claim that they're liberals, they think Africa is a place of like typhoid fever and malaria and, you know, people who are primitive and don't know how to cook. And it's like, no, Africa is a place of innovation. It's a place of beauty. It's a place of intelligence. And he brought all that to the table for America to see that. And I think I haven't seen anything like that on a platform that big in a long time, you know? I mean, we have our own shows, like, you know, we have our Demand Africa channel, we have our, you know, Nollywood and Ghanaian movies, but to bring it to that level, like Top Chef, I thought that was amazing. The fact that he just used flavors that we all grew up with, I mean, we all meaning as Ghanaians grew up with time and time again. And
Hey guys, so we had some technical difficulties while recording with Vonnie and had to end the conversation to fix them at this point. Here's the rest of the conversation where Vonnie continues her thoughts on Top Chef and Chef Eric Ejapong's representation on the show.
What was I saying? So yeah, what Chef Eric did on Top Chef was beautiful in terms of bringing African culture beyond jollof rice. So to speak. So, you know, that should be. I should rename this podcast Beyond Jollof Rice.
I'm making the tagline Beyond Jollof Rice.
You can gladly take it. I wanted to live on beyond me, so. I love what he did, and he was just like, he killed it. He killed it every
Yeah,
single
I know. There
time.
were so many times I like honestly was like I can't even like I just had tears. I was like, I can't believe like this is it was just anyway, out
Yeah.
of this world amazing. So good for him, and I'm glad he's gone on to do, it sounds like he's gone on to do other things like off of his Top Chef experience. So that's great. Um so well, we're gonna wrap up shortly here. What's next for you? What's next for Vonnie? And well, 2019 is almost over, so let's push you to 2020. What are we doing? How are we leveling up in 2020?
Ooh, how are we leveling up in 2020? Ooh. I haven't even thought about that. Like I didn't make my goal for 2020 yet.
No pressure.
I'm gonna give you our preview though. Great question. Continue to freelance. I've took a little bit of a break from it, but definitely want to come back 2020 strong. Definitely talk and just write more stories about the African diaspora, about my experiences with food, about just, I'm always looking for really interesting stories and what is the story behind the story, you know? I think my background is interesting too, because I also grew up in Newark for most of my life. Like if I wasn't in Newark, I was in Ghana, you know?
Yeah.
And so just also having that identity as well is something that I've been wanting to explore in a more outward fashion, just kind of like just growing up in two different cultures.
Right.
And just, you know, how do you navigate that? Because that's a lot of our experiences as first and second gen immigrants, you know, and to just continue to move the conversation about foods of the diaspora and foods of the continent forward. My hope is that this is not just another trend, because this is what people have been eating and growing for millennia, and that Africa eventually becomes not just a trend, but it becomes part of the culinary canon, you know? Like people talk about French food and Italian food and American food and New American. I still don't really know what New American is. Whatever. I want the foods of the continent to be up there. I mean, to me, in my head, it already is up there. I'm just waiting for everybody else to, you know, get with the program.
Right.
And for me, not just to talk about African food has, you know, if you're not Morocco or South African, you know, your food doesn't count. You know, I want foods from not almost every country of the continent to be represented. I want that diversity to be seen so people can see that Africa is a wonderful and beautiful place, and like the world will be nothing without it.
Right.
Strong statement, but I believe it.
That's a really great note to end on. But before we transition to rapid fire, can you remind people where they can find you online, on social media?
Well, you can catch me at Sincerely Vonnie on Instagram and Twitter. And you can catch me on www.sincerelyvonnie.com. Great.
Okay. Rapid fire questions. So really quick, they're not difficult. Just so people get to know a little bit more about you. So here we go. Morning person or night person?
Oh, definitely a morning person.
Oh, good. Starter or dessert?
Oh, dessert. Oh, through and through.
And then when you're feeling lazy, what do you like to cook?
I don't cook anything, honestly. I just order food.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
That's the way to go. That's the way to go. And then if you could live on one dish for the rest of your life, what would that be?
Ooh. I never tired of Benku and okra stew. I don't know why. But I eat that more often than I want to admit right now.
Do you make that in your
rarely.
Okay, yeah.
No, if I feel like it, yeah. But there's a Ghanaian Ivorian buffet not too far from my house. I just go there because to make okra stew would take forever. I'm like, yeah, they already made it for me. It tastes good. I'm just gonna go there.
And then to that point, what's your favorite African restaurant anywhere in the world?
Ooh, so I like Accra restaurant, but the one in the Bronx.
Oh, interesting.
To me, they have the best like Ghanaian food I've tasted. That in a place that I knew in high school, but they closed years and years and years ago.
Interesting. So I went to Accra restaurant in Harlem yesterday, just because I was in Harlem for the Africa Restaurant Week Festival.
Mm-hmm.
So I was like, I'm there. I might as well to try it for the first time. So I should try. I mean, it was okay, but I guess I should be trying the one in the Bronx.
Yeah, you should. That's what everybody said. They're like, oh, it's okay. And I'm like, I hope this doesn't go on the podcast, but I like the one in Harlem, but the one in the Bronx to me is a lot more representative of like the flavors that you grew up. Whereas I feel like the Acquire in Harlem is kind of tailored for the other communities around, which is also great. But if I'm eating Ghanaian food, I want to feel like somebody pounded the food themselves.
And they had their sweat in it and all.
Exactly. The Ghanaian sweat. That's what I want.
Well, that's interesting because when I was looking it up to go, someone had said that it was not made by Ghanaians, but that's a whole other story anyway. Okay.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
We'll talk about that later.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much for the time. This is like such an interesting topic for me, and I think you're the perfect person to talk about it with. I actually, like I've been talking off the top of my head, I actually think this would be a good in-person conversation. But we can talk about that offline. But
yes.
I think it's should be a great conversation to have with the community too. But I appreciate your time. Thank you for talking with me. And hopefully people enjoy this as much as we did.
Yes, this was really fun. It was a good way to start my Sunday afternoon.
Yeah.
So thank you for that.
So much.
Thank you for listening to Item 13, an African food podcast. If you like the show, please subscribe, rate, and review us on your favorite podcast app. To keep up to date, follow us on Instagram, Facebook, and Twitter at Item 13 Podcast. Thank you.
Hey there, I'm Lee Ullman here with some big news from the National Young Farmers Coalition. We're partnering with Heritage Radio Network on a special season of The Farm Report. It's all about what's happening with the Farm Bill and how it impacts farmers and eaters.
I am growing diversified vegetables on land that's been in our family for 150 years.
And so with the pandemic, gentrification, property values going up, we had to sell the land and we lost it.
Join us as we uncover the untold stories behind this massive piece of legislation that shapes how we grow our food, what we eat, and so much more.
The problems we have had, those are things that come from earlier Farm Bill and USDA policy, right? Like Earl Butts, get big or get out.
You know, it's my responsibility to know not only what I'm eating, but then like how that all came to be. And realize like, wow, like this piece of legislation, all this money, like it's technically something that I support as a taxpayer.
While Congress debates the next Farm Bill, this is not just an invitation to listen. It's a call to action. Be part of the conversation. Subscribe to the Farm Report on Heritage Radio Network, wherever you listen to podcasts.